Just 3 minutes ago, everything changed. Whispers turned to gasps, and silence swept through the palace halls. Catherine, Princess of Wales, has just called for a full-scale forensic audit after personally uncovering shocking discrepancies buried deep within the royal ledgers. But what exactly did she see that drove her to challenge an entire royal system? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The day began like any other at Kensington Palace. The morning air was brisk, the palace staff moved in practiced rhythm, and Catherine sat in a quiet study reviewing her routine briefing documents, a ritual she'd taken seriously since stepping into her role as future queen. But this morning was different. Slipped between the mundane figures and summaries was a set of numbers that didn't quite add up. A series of transactions masked under generic budget codes jumped out at her. At first, she thought it might be an error. But as she read further, her heart began to pound. These weren't just oversights. They were deliberate manipulations. And they led somewhere. Without alerting her aides, she cross-referenced documents from previous briefings. What she discovered was more than troubling, it was explosive. Hundreds of thousands of pounds had been funneled through obscure accounts, buried within obscure budget lines labeled with phrases like Heritage Fund Reconciliation or Foreign Outreach Advisory. The numbers were veiled but not invisible. Not to someone like Catherine, who, over the years, had trained herself to read between the lines. She didn't need a team of investigators to see it. Something was being hidden. Something serious. In a move that would shake the palace to its core, Catherine immediately summoned the internal auditors without notifying the royal advisors. The bypassing of royal protocol sent shockwaves through the institution. Catherine wasn't simply asking questions. She was demanding answers. Her request was firm, direct, and public within the palace walls. No whispered speculation, no subtle inquiry. A full forensic audit was to begin immediately, with unrestricted access and no interference. The message was clear. This wasn't an internal review. It was a declaration of war on secrecy. Inside Kensington Palace, the mood shifted from routine to frantic. Loyalists to the traditional order scrambled to contain the fallout. Some began deleting messages. Others whispered in corridors. The staff was divided, those who believed in Catherine's moral courage, and those who feared the wrath her defiance might bring down upon them all. Yet Catherine stood unwavering. Her posture, her voice, her eyes none, carried the hesitancy of someone asking permission. She was demanding accountability. She was invoking truth. And she wasn't alone. William, who had been unaware of the brewing storm, walked into the eye of it when Catherine delivered the news personally. He listened, stunned, as she laid out the discrepancies, the coded diversions, the gravity of what she had found. Torn between the duty that binds him to the crown and the trust that ties him to his wife, William said nothing at first. But his silence only amplified the weight of the moment. Catherine wasn't waiting for permission. She was moving forward with or without him. But Catherine's actions were not impulsive, because this moment wasn't born in a single discovery. It was the result of months of quiet suspicion and silent betrayal. Tucked away in a locked cabinet inside a lesser-known royal office were ledgers the public never knew existed. How did Catherine get access? Who left the door open? And why did the contents lead to pure horror? What began as a chilling anomaly had now spiraled into something far more insidious. Catherine wasn't hunting for trouble, she was trying to understand it. But the answers she was about to find weren't just buried in spreadsheets, they were deliberately hidden, tucked behind a door few ever entered. The room itself was unremarkable, tucked near the west wing and largely forgotten. But someone had tipped her off. A quiet knock. A message slipped beneath her chamber door. No name, no explanation, just a location and a single sentence. They're hiding the truth. With her heart thudding like war drums, Catherine entered the room, accompanied by a trusted member of her personal staff. The cabinet wasn't just locked, it was reinforced. Yet somehow, a key had been left behind. And when she turned it, what stared back at her wasn't paper, it was betrayal. Dozens of ledgers lined the drawers, untouched by auditors and immune to public inquiry. They weren't part of any official palace account, nor filed under the Crown Estate or sovereign grant. They were private, clandestine, and deeply guarded. As she flipped through the first ledger, Catherine's hands stiffened. Expenditures were coded with vague designations: consulting A, foreign allocation B, and discretionary support. At first glance, the entries felt clinical, emotionless. But the numbers beneath them told a very different story. Huge sums, some in the millions, had been dispersed to what appeared to be shell entities. Names she didn't recognize. Countries with strained diplomatic ties. Trusts connected to causes the palace had publicly denied involvement with. And the dates, they spanned over a decade. As she read deeper, Catherine's breath caught. One page showed an unusually high consulting fee paid to a charitable trust that, on the surface, supported youth education abroad. But Catherine had visited the organization 2 years earlier and knew it barely functioned. Another entry linked funds to a foreign environmental foundation that had long been under scrutiny for laundering donor contributions. These weren't accidents, they were deliberate diversions. Someone, perhaps several someones, had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep this information buried. But now it was in her hands, and Catherine knew there was no going back. What troubled her most wasn't just the betrayal of public trust, but the realization that the palace had, for years, quietly siphoned resources into causes that bypassed parliamentary scrutiny. This wasn't simply mismanagement. It was manipulation. And someone inside had left her a path to follow. Why now? Why her? She didn't know. But one thing was clear: this was no longer a quiet audit. It was an unraveling. She slipped several pages into her leather folder, carefully resealing the cabinet and locking the door behind her. No alarms, no signs, just cold silence. But beneath her calm exterior, a storm raged. This wasn't just about numbers, it was about power, and how far the monarchy would go to protect it. She wasn't ready to reveal her hand just yet, but she was preparing for a confrontation no one saw coming. But as Catherine prepared to expose what she found, she faced an even darker realization: the cover-up went higher than she ever imagined. What Catherine didn't expect was Camilla. Behind the royal smile lay something far more strategic and possibly sinister. Tracing the irregularities led straight to the Queen Consort's network of longtime advisors, secret charities, and obscure trusts. The further Catherine followed the trail of discrepancies, the more unsettling the patterns became. The names of 3 distinct organizations surfaced repeatedly, each of them claiming to operate independently, yet all curiously connected through overlapping board members, shared trustees, and financial contributions from entities close to Camilla. These weren't your standard royal charities. Their paperwork was vague, their reporting minimal, and their impact nearly invisible. It didn't take long for Catherine to realize these weren't institutions meant to serve, they were carefully constructed shields. And at the center of them all stood Queen Camilla, whose involvement was never direct but always close enough to raise eyebrows. It was a web, one that had taken years to spin. When a former royal accountant, long silent under the weight of confidentiality, reached out through a protected channel, the implications shook Catherine to her core. He didn't speak plainly, he couldn't, but what he hinted at made the blood drain from her face. He referenced financial preservations arranged by a trusted inner circle, patterns of protecting certain assets and rerouting public funds into more private hands, always under the guise of royal necessity. He stopped short of accusing Camilla directly, but his wording was careful, and the message between the lines was unmistakable. The Queen Consort had influence over more than appearances, she had influence over the money. Catherine took this information to her closest advisors, only to be met with an unsettling silence. Then came the warnings. Not all wars in the monarchy were fought in public. Challenging Camilla wouldn't just ignite a palace scandal, it would send a shockwave through the entire royal order. Camilla had spent years cultivating loyalty among senior staff, high-ranking aides, and longtime allies. To accuse her, even by implication, would be seen as an act of rebellion. It wasn't just the monarchy's reputation at stake, it was Catherine's own standing, her family's future, and the fragile trust she held with King Charles himself. And yet, in the privacy of her chambers, Catherine began noticing changes. A sudden coldness in palace correspondence. Cancelled meetings. Quiet glances that once held deference now edged with suspicion. She wasn't paranoid, she was being watched. Word had gotten out that she was digging, and the walls were beginning to close in. But still, she pressed forward. Every line of questioning, every document traced, every thread pulled back, led her further into Camilla's network, and deeper into a truth too dark to ignore. William, torn and uneasy, started seeing the outline of a reality he had tried hard to deny. Subtle but recurring signs suggested Camilla had a greater role in influencing Charles's financial decisions than previously believed. Whenever scrutiny was raised about royal spending, Camilla had an answer before anyone asked. She always seemed to know where pressure would come from and how to snuff it out. Then came the whisper of something older. A rumor resurfaced, barely remembered, of a similar cover-up from years ago, an audit that was called off last minute, supposedly due to clerical redundancy. But those who remembered it swore Camilla had been involved. It was dismissed as gossip then. But now, with the documents Catherine held and the emerging pattern of behavior, it felt like a blueprint being repeated. Still, Catherine refuses to back down. But exposing Camilla means risking everything, including her standing in the monarchy and the trust of the king himself. For William, the pressure is unbearable. His wife is demanding full transparency. His stepmother stands accused, and his father, Charles III, remains eerily silent. In the battle between blood and truth, William must finally choose. The moment Catherine closed the door behind her, everything changed. She laid the papers on the table, her eyes locked onto William's. And for a heartbeat, the future King of England forgot how to breathe. What he read wasn't just alarming, it was staggering. Names, transactions, dates, whispers of cover-ups, and a trail that pointed uncomfortably close to Queen Camilla. At first, William tried to rationalize it, tried to explain it away, but the evidence refused to bend. His disbelief quickly gave way to dread. Every part of him wanted to trust the institution, to believe that there was some mistake, but the woman sitting in front of him had never spoken with such conviction. Catherine wasn't speculating. She knew. And that terrified him more than the documents themselves. The tension between William and Camilla had never truly disappeared, it merely simmered beneath formal smiles and stiff courtesies. But now, with these revelations, the veneer shattered. Every polite exchange, every forced photograph suddenly reeked of something manipulative. And when Charles summoned William to Clarence House under the pretense of a family check-in, the conversation was anything but transparent. Charles avoided the topic entirely, his gaze deflective, his demeanor composed to the point of being cold. Not once did he mention the audit. Not once did he ask about Catherine. And that silence screamed louder than any denial. Back at Kensington, advisors circled like hawks. They pleaded with William to get Catherine under control, to issue a calming statement, to frame the audit as a routine administrative review. But William, for the first time, pushed back. He wasn't the boy caught between two feuding parents anymore, he was the man watching the foundations of his future kingdom crumble. And yet, his hands shook. He knew the cost of choosing sides. To support Catherine openly was to challenge the crown's silence, to position himself against the very institution he was destined to lead. But to ignore her was to betray the woman who had sacrificed everything to stand beside him. The weight of the crisis was no longer hidden behind closed doors. It spilled into public appearances, William's clipped tone with the press, Catherine's absence from scheduled events, the palpable coldness between Charles and his son during a joint engagement. The public noticed. The tabloids speculated. And behind palace walls, the emotional toll was beginning to seep into every corner of the royal family's image. William drafted a statement, carefully worded, aiming to project unity while buying time. But when he showed it to Catherine, she shook her head. Not out of anger, but out of principle. She wouldn't co-sign a lie, not even for him, not even to ease the pressure. This was her battle, and she would not dilute its truth with royal niceties. William stood at the edge of a decision that would define not just his marriage but his legacy. One path led to comfort and compliance, the other, to confrontation and uncertainty. But he knew one thing with painful clarity: the truth had already been set in motion, and any attempt to bury it now would only deepen the wound. And while the prince struggles with loyalty, Charles III begins his own covert operation to erase the trail before the audit becomes public. As the monarchy teeters on the brink of scandal, Charles III does the one thing no one expected: he goes silent. Behind closed doors, however, the king is anything but passive. And what he's doing now could make or break his legacy. The king's silence was not a retreat. It was a strategy calculated, cold, and quietly devastating. As headlines swirled with whispers of an impending audit, as palace corridors hummed with speculation and fear, Charles projected the image of an unshaken sovereign. He carried out his public duties with composure, offered no comment, and allowed the media storm to rage unchecked. But inside the palace, the game had already changed. With a few hushed phone calls and carefully worded directives, Charles began severing the weakest links. Several senior financial advisors were dismissed in rapid succession, each departure buried beneath the polished language of retirement or restructuring. No explanation was offered, no warning given. They were simply gone erased, like names from an inconvenient chapter. But the dismissals were only the beginning. In the dead of night, an encrypted message was transmitted from within the royal network to a private offshore account, a move that triggered a quiet alert within an intelligence agency monitoring international financial anomalies. The message itself was innocuous in appearance, cloaked in legal terminology, and routed through layers of plausible deniability. But to those who understood the codes, it was unmistakably a signal. The king wasn't merely protecting the crown's image, he was protecting something far more sensitive and far more dangerous. Then, just as Catherine prepared to escalate her review with another request for access to archived financial records, the palace system suffered what was publicly described as a technical failure. Emails went offline, internal servers crashed, phone lines scrambled. For 24 hours, the palace existed in digital darkness. It was a plausible coincidence until Catherine was informed that the specific documents she had requested no longer existed. The archives, she was told, had been subject to a cyclical purge that occurred routinely. But the timing was too precise. The purge, too convenient. Someone was scrubbing the past, page by page. What ignited Catherine's fury wasn't just the obstruction, it was the clarity that came with it. This wasn't Camilla pulling strings in the background. This was Charles. Not as a misinformed monarch unaware of the storm gathering beneath him, but as an active player, orchestrating the palace's silent resistance from the shadows. He wasn't simply avoiding scandal, he was preemptively burning the trail. And with every erased document, every silenced advisor, every dismissed staff member, Catherine understood the war had shifted. It was a senior aide, one of the few still loyal to her, who finally confirmed what she had begun to suspect. "He's not protecting Camilla," the aide whispered. "He's protecting himself." The words hit like thunder. If Charles was involved, even peripherally, in the financial web now unraveling around them, the implications would be catastrophic, not just for his reign, but for the monarchy's very future. And yet, despite the quiet destruction around her, Catherine did not waver. The palace might hide the truth behind walls of tradition and digital firewalls, but outside those gates, a different court awaited. But Catherine, now armed with undeniable evidence, takes the fight beyond the palace walls and into the court of public opinion. When the palace refuses transparency, Catherine does the unthinkable. She leaks a fragment of the audit to a trusted journalist. The monarchy has always thrived on secrecy. But now, it's bleeding truth, live on every screen. There's a line every royal is trained never to cross: the invisible boundary between duty and rebellion, between protecting the crown and confronting it. And Catherine, who once walked that line with poise and discipline, has now stepped over it without hesitation. After being denied access, gaslit by officials, and stonewalled by the king himself, she realized something painful. The palace would rather let the truth die in silence than face the shame of accountability. But Catherine would not be a prisoner of that silence. In the dead of night, she contacted an old acquaintance, a journalist known for precision, integrity, and an ironclad code of confidentiality. She didn't reveal her identity, but the information she handed over spoke volumes. It was just one page, one transaction, one perfectly preserved document showing a six-figure payout to a defunct charity linked to an offshore account sanctioned under royal oversight. The journalist, stunned by its implications, didn't hesitate. The story went live within hours. And then, the internet did the rest. Within moments, the page had gone viral, shared across platforms, dissected by experts, and echoed in headlines around the globe. The palace, blindsided, issued a lukewarm statement about misinformation. But it was too late. The dam had cracked, and the flood was just beginning. Charities that once aligned themselves proudly with royal patronage suddenly went quiet or worse, demanded answers. Several publicly called for an independent investigation, distancing themselves from the crown's silence. Protesters, young and old, gathered outside Buckingham Palace, waving signs that called for reform, justice, and most jarringly, truth. Chants echoed beneath the palace gates. Where's the money? Transparency now. Not above the law. For a monarchy built on mystique, the exposure was unbearable. Yet while the establishment reeled, Catherine stood firm. She didn't claim credit. She didn't issue statements. But the public knew. They recognized her courage, her fire, her refusal to be complicit in corruption. Editorials across the globe hailed her as the people's future queen, a woman of moral clarity in a world obsessed with image. Polls surged in her favor. And though she had broken every unwritten rule of royal conduct, she had done so with unshakable grace. She didn't burn the palace down. She simply held up a mirror to it and let the people see what they'd been denied for years. Of course, not everyone applauded her defiance. Inside the institution, there was fury. Traditionalists labeled her a traitor, a threat to stability, a danger to the very fabric of monarchy. Old allies turned their backs. Trusted aides disappeared from her circle. There were whispers of exile, removal, and reputational assassination. But Catherine did not waver, because she knew the truth was not treason, and that silence, in the face of corruption, was. Now, the pressure has escalated beyond titles and tradition. The monarchy faces an existential question: can it survive the storm it tried to silence? As Catherine rises, so do the knives behind her back. Whispers swirl through ancestral halls. Trusted allies go quiet. And in the shadows, certain royals begin plotting, not just to stop her, but to remove her entirely. The palace had not seen disruption like this in generations. What began as a quiet audit had now detonated into a full-blown constitutional crisis. And Catherine, once the calm within the storm, had become its eye. Her refusal to retreat had rattled the gilded foundations, but it also made her a threat, not just to secrets, but to power. Inside a discreet drawing room, far from the public eye, Princess Anne met with a long-serving advisor. The topic was delicate but direct. The institution, they agreed, needed a reset. And if that meant reducing Catherine's role to a ceremonial shadow, so be it. Her independence, her refusal to be controlled, was no longer seen as strength, it was seen as defiance. And the firm had never tolerated defiance for long. Simultaneously, a name long thought buried emerged from the wreckage: Prince Andrew. Hidden deep within the financial irregularities was a cluster of transactions linked to shell companies once affiliated with his overseas ventures. Though his public role had been dismantled years earlier, it became painfully clear that the money never stopped moving. The monarchy's crisis was no longer theoretical, it was widening by the hour. Catherine's findings were drawing blood, and the royal machine, sensing danger, began turning inward. King Charles, now cornered between silence and scandal, floated the idea of a quieter life for William and Catherine, perhaps abroad, under the guise of rest and recovery. But no one believed the pretext. It wasn't exile by name, but it carried the scent of it. And behind closed doors, the message was clear: leave or be made to. The pressure was relentless. But Catherine, unwavering, stayed put. She would not vanish. Not now. Not when the truth was finally breaking through the palace walls. And then came Meghan. In a calculated move that set the media ablaze, she posted a cryptic statement online. It didn't name names, it didn't cite events, but the implication was unmistakable. Some of us left the system, she wrote, because we saw what it did to truth. The message was subtle, elegant, and explosive. It reignited public interest in her own past claims, and for the first time, Catherine and Meghan were no longer viewed as rivals, but as two women crushed by the same machine, resisting in different ways. Inside the palace, paranoia gripped every corridor. Surveillance was quietly increased. Staff were told to report unusual conversations. Communications were monitored for leaks. But it went further. Catherine noticed messages disappearing from her phone. Conversations she'd had with aides suddenly denied. Devices acting strangely. She wasn't imagining it, she was being watched. Her privacy had been breached. And still, no one acknowledged it. Because in this battle for control, truth wasn't the goal, containment was. Even William began to feel the weight of isolation. Old friends kept their distance. Family members spoke in half sentences. It became harder to tell who was loyal and who was waiting for them to fall. Every step Catherine took now felt like walking a wire above a kingdom that wanted her silent. The betrayal wasn't loud, it was quiet, precise, and suffocating. But just as betrayal closes in around her, an unexpected figure steps out of the shadows with proof that could destroy everything. The audit was never supposed to see daylight. But one man has seen too much and lived too long in fear. Now, with everything on the line, the royal accountant comes forward, with receipts that could collapse the crown. He had been silent for years, a fixture within the palace walls, hidden in plain sight behind ledgers, spreadsheets, and the burden of secrets no man should be forced to carry. But in the face of Catherine's crusade, something shifted. The retired royal accountant, now living abroad under a new identity, recorded a single video from an undisclosed location. No media fanfare, no dramatic stage, just one man, one camera, and the unfiltered truth. His voice trembled not from fear, but from the sheer weight of what he was about to reveal. Over the course of nearly an hour, he confirmed the unthinkable financial deception had not only existed, it had thrived, cultivated under the watchful gaze of those sworn to protect the institution. He named names. He cited amounts. He displayed documents original, signed, and timestamped that outlined a system designed not for accountability, but for concealment. Over 15 years of financial maneuvering, funds redirected under vague labels, trusts manipulated, charities used as veils. It was all there. And among the names listed were not just advisors or staffers, but royals themselves. Those still seated at the highest levels of the monarchy. What Catherine had suspected, what she had risked everything to uncover, was now undeniable. The truth had a voice, and it had finally spoken. The video was not leaked, it was sent, directly to Catherine. Accompanied by a brief message, "Do not let them bury this." And she didn't. Within hours, she assembled a team independent, trusted, armed with legal authority. The palace tried to get ahead of it, launching a smear campaign against the whistleblower. They painted him as disgruntled, unstable, driven by revenge. But it backfired. Public sympathy only grew, bolstered by the depth of evidence in the man's calm, measured delivery. He wasn't angry, he was exhausted. And that exhaustion, more than any dramatics, made his testimony real. The video swept through every corner of the media. Experts dissected it. Analysts traced the paper trail. And as the palace fumbled for control, one truth became clear: this scandal would not be weathered with silence. The monarchy, for all its grandeur, was now on trial in the court of public opinion. The illusion of untouchable dignity had cracked. And standing at the center of it all was Catherine, no longer just a princess but a reckoning. In response, an emergency session of senior royals was called. No press was informed, no aides were permitted to record. And yet, it was Catherine who walked into the room with the power of truth on her side. She didn't demand loyalty. She demanded justice. The men and women seated before her were not just family, they were stakeholders in a kingdom losing its grip on credibility. And for the first time, they were forced to listen. And now, the final reckoning begins not just for the guilty, but for the monarchy itself. This is the moment it all leads to. Catherine, armed with the truth, steps into the lion's den surrounded by those who would silence her. But she's not afraid. Because this time the monarchy will answer. The room was smaller than expected. No cameras, no media, just 4 individuals, each holding the weight of a nation's trust or its betrayal. Catherine didn't wait to be asked. She stepped forward and laid the evidence on the table, every page a testament to what had been hidden, twisted, stolen. Her voice was calm but unwavering. She wasn't here to plead. She was here to expose. The king, pale and still, said nothing at first. Camilla looked away. William's jaw clenched, his silence carved from weeks of inner conflict. Then Catherine made her demand clear. A full third-party audit, no interference, and a public release of all findings. The room froze, not from shock, but from the realization that this time, there would be no quiet escape. It was William who spoke first, and when he did, his words changed everything. He looked not at Catherine, but at his father. The pause before his declaration stretched into eternity. Then came the break. "I support her," he said. "Not just as a husband, but as a future king. The people deserve the truth. We can't lead a kingdom built on shadows." The sentence was a severing. With it, he cut ties to the quiet complicity the crown had long relied upon. It wasn't rebellion, it was rebirth. And for the first time, Charles knew he had lost control of the narrative. The king didn't argue. He simply nodded. The movement slow, weary, and far too late. But he added a condition: there would be no public blame. No direct naming of senior royals in the report. The institution would acknowledge failure, not individual guilt. It was a compromise neither side celebrated, but one Catherine accepted for now. What mattered more was the precedent. The silence had been broken. The wall of secrecy had been breached, and behind it, justice was waiting. Camilla's response came not in words but in consequences. Within days, her public appearances were scaled back. Her portfolio of charitable patronages was quietly reduced. No statement was issued. No headlines announced her shift. But those watching closely understood power had shifted. And she was no longer at its center. The monarchy didn't expel her. It simply moved her to the margins, where influence becomes suggestion and visibility becomes shadow. Then came the statement. For the first time in history, the royal family released a formal acknowledgement of past financial failures and confirmed the commissioning of an independent audit. The language was diplomatic, measured, and cautious, but its meaning was seismic. Centuries of secrecy had given way to a single sentence of truth. And while it would not erase the damage, it would begin the reckoning. Catherine didn't celebrate. There were no grand gestures, no victory speeches. But she knew what had been achieved. She had pulled the veil from a kingdom of silence and shown the world that even the oldest thrones must answer when the people demanded. Her fight had not been for power, but for principle. And in doing so, she became more than a royal figure. She became a force the monarchy could no longer suppress. And though the dust settles for now, Catherine has changed the royal game forever. Because once the truth is spoken, silence is never enough. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.